So I'd really like to welcome Tom to the stage. Tom is the Chief Executive of the Community Land Trust Network and is involved in all sorts of other things as well. But here today he's come to talk in his role as CEO. So I'm not going to say any more about your CV, which is very lengthy and comprehensive, all sorts of highly relevant stuff. So I'll just leave you, Tom, to highlight anything else that you think the audience needs to know. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Linda. I'm sure you don't need to know very much about me. Other than my digestion is just trying to process having rapidly tried to eat all my lunch before I came to talk to you. So I head up the Community Land Trust Network. We're a membership body of 356 odd community landowners around England and Wales. Some of our members and people connected to our network are in the room. And we are a network. We're a horizontal group of people trying to promote resilience through community ownership of land and affordable housing. And I'm going to try something that is either going to be a bold success or a bit of a disaster in talking without slides and with some notes I've just had on my phone to try to draw together some of the themes that I've heard today and some of the feedback that I've had from yesterday in thinking about resilience in the context of housing. I actually just want to start with a little extract from a book called My Struggle, Volume 2 by Carl Knausgaard. Has anyone read Knausgaard's Struggle series? No, you should. It's a very good Norwegian writer. He, in his second book, is writing about returning to the town he grew up in, which he's written about quite a bit in that book and in the first instalment, and how rich with meaning that place is to him. And as he drives past his former home, his old schools and so on, he says, all the places I carried inside me, which I had visualized many, many times in my life, passed outside the windows completely auraless, totally neutral, the way they were, in fact. There was nothing, but lives were still being lived in these houses, and they were still everything for the people inside. What this speaks to for me is that when we think about homes, lives, communities, they aren't physical things that we can see. It's not there in the built environment. These are things that exist as epiphenomena. They are things around and within those spaces, which are the lived experiences of people who live there, who have lived there in the past, and who maybe will live there in the future. But we're very bad at thinking about this in the housing sector. So much so that what I often come across is people seeing phantoms or seeing places through their own filters and prejudices. So I used to live in a part of London called Crystal Palace and had friends who lived on a council estate called Central Hill. Now, the council had employed architects to come and do a consultation as part of their objective to demolish and rebuild the estate. And the architects advertised the first consultation evening with a tweet with a picture of a walkway at night time with the message, would you want to walk down here? We're going to redevelop this estate. Clear implication this is basically an unsafe place to live. It just so happens that walkway was designed by the first Grade 1 female architect at the Greater London Council. It's actually had a lot of awards at the time. It's a very prestigious and well-designed estate, and that walkway is a good example of active travel. But putting that to one side, it's also didn't speak at all to the lived experiences of the people who actually live there, who value some of the aspects of the layout of that estate. Similar things happened in another case I was involved in London, the Haygate estate, quite a notorious example, which is often described as being a place that was sort of ridden with crime. Now, crime statistics from the police show it actually had a lower crime level than London, than the wider borough of Southwark as a whole, and it was pure prejudice to think there was a lot of crime on that estate. But not only that, it suggested that therefore that was an unsafe place to live, and the best thing to do is to demolish it, rebuild it, and scatter everybody out, and then they maybe would come back. But what it didn't see, preoccupied with the idea that it was full of crime, was it was full of social networks. It was full of relationships between people who lived there, who supported each other, and who gave them a resilience through those social networks that was nothing to do with the design of walkways and the layout of buildings and so on. One of our members is a couple of estates in Maida Vale called Walterton and Elgin Community Homes. They remain one of the only examples to this day in the UK of an estate threatened with demolition that managed through an immense struggle to take ownership of the estates, so they're now completely community-owned. 600 social housing units in central London owned by the community for the community, and they then don't just have some sort of consultative response or ability to deal with, they don't get consulted, they don't get co-produced, it's in their hands. And so they can bring their lived experience to the way that they redevelop their estate. They have demolished some buildings that were asbestos-ridden and unsuitable. They've built more flats on top of existing blocks. They've built an infill development. That all comes from the experience of knowledge of what that community needs and the fact that they needed a new nursery space and they needed a new workspace and so on. It's a different way of coming to how do you make that community resilient. And for us as the Community Land Trust Network, part of the answer to the resilience comes through the ownership of those assets, through the ownership of the land, because I think as Ollie was saying yesterday, land is where you start and land is power. So we talk about building communities, and I think it's a weird term because you can't build a community in the way of much as Agile will be doing great things. Agile doesn't build communities. The people who move into those homes and live in that area are going to build the community. Melissa Mean from We Can Make, one of our members in South Bristol, talks about building relationships, not units. Their role is both to provide more homes in the North-West area of South Bristol, but to do so in a way that involves people and creates social connection and social fabric through the process of doing it. So one of their first tenants was a guy who had been homeless and out of work for a long time, and through being involved in that project, through having agency in meeting his own housing need, he gained new skills, gained relationships and friendships, and has got his life back on track. That's something that isn't to do with the house itself, it's to do with the fact that he was involved in that process and had agency and power. One of my favourite works at university was Marx's early philosophical works. So he wrote this before he went on to do Das Kapital and the more famous works, in which he talks about alienation as a symptom of the capitalist mode of production. And what he talked about was that if you aren't in control of your own work, if you aren't in control of the thing that you produce, if you aren't in control of the relationships you have with other people, you're alienated from those things. You're fundamentally at the control of somebody else in those three fundamental aspects of your life. And this is a form, an issue not only with, say, his analysis of capitalism, but I would also pin that on our paternalistic model of housing in this country, that we don't give people agency over the home that they live in, and we've heard a lot of that today in terms of, particularly if you've got greater vulnerabilities or greater needs, you have no agency over who you live with, how you come to have that housing, how it's designed, and so on. And the consequence of that can be very serious. So the local trust have done really, really interesting work in recent years looking at areas they characterise as left behind. And they show that those areas during COVID had far fewer mutual aid groups than areas with equivalent levels of deprivation but less social infrastructure. So if you have fewer rich relationships in your community of the sort that they had at the Haygate estate, even though you're just as deprived as another place, that other place does better. That other place also draws down more charitable grant funding. There are many indicators showing the ways in which communities that lack that social infrastructure do worse, all other things being equal. Another aspect of resilience that I think has come up particularly yesterday from Paul Chatton is climate resilience. How can communities be resilient if they have no agency and power in doing anything about the challenges that face them? One of my favourite examples was Lancaster Co-housing, who, having developed their houses on the banks of the River Lune, they'd already thought about flood risk, and they tried to make sure that they were high enough above the riverbank they wouldn't get flooded. And then, do you remember those huge floods sort of 10, 15 years ago in the northwest? And the river came pretty much up to their doorsteps. So they got together as a community to discuss, what do we do about this? How do we have an emergency flood plan? How do we man the sandbags? And also, maybe we could redesign some aspects of this scheme to be more resilient to this. They were able to do that because they were organised as a community, and they had become organised through the process of building the homes and then managing them. If they were just a group of individual private house owners who'd bought something off a volume developer and had no form of social organisation or network in that area, they'd be saying, where's the council? How are they going to come and save us? how can we build conditions for resilience then into our model for housing and regeneration? We do it by building in social connection to the way that we produce housing. So we build in community. We do it by giving power and agency to those people, including through the ownership of the land. And we do it in a way that is preserved in perpetuity and isn't just a feature that is a part of the design process, but is going to be in place for the next 100 years, holding it in trust. And that's all a community land trust is. That's the purpose of it, is to build resilience and capability in communities. But how do we do that in the system? So Bristol has been known for many years as being a bit of a pioneer of community-led housing and a major supporter of it. But in some ways, I think the City Council and the way that the approach that's been taken in the city is a bit of a dead end. Because what's happened is that communities have been given the worst possible sites and then slightly left to run with it. I mean, the council has done as much as it could in some ways to support them. But it's really said, we've got the mainstream system over here, so we're going to redevelop large sites, we're going to have Gorham homes doing developments, we're going to do all this stuff the normal way. Anything the system can't handle, we're going to leave you to deal with, which is just a very weird way of going about it. We've also sometimes expected too much. There's a really interesting experiment going on at the moment with Housing 21 in Birmingham and co-housing. And it's sort of asking people, could you leap up to the highest level of citizen participation and power with a group of people who aren't capable already of taking that step yet, but has not figured out yet where are the stepping stones that meaningfully give people the ability to climb that ladder, as Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, for example, without kind of capping it artificially by saying, well, we're only going to give you the things that we think you should have control over. I was thinking about Kate's dial of support need. You know, most people don't need anything other than the home, but some people need more support, or Claire's complex map of health stakeholders. And the danger is always that we take resilience, therefore, to mean people are vulnerable, so they need support. But Richard earlier talking about his experience of this, you know, a desire to be an agent of change in that all the same, not just a statistic because you happen to be in the red bit of Kate's dial. If you look internationally, people are thinking about this and doing this in a fundamentally different way, and they're doing it in a way that is mainstream in the way that they try to tackle housing problems. So I was in Barcelona in the summer for the International Social Housing Festival. And now just imagine if this had happened in Bristol. They've taken land for 1,000 homes, decent quality sites across the city. They're putting all of them into a community land trust for the city. They have 2 partnerships of developers with finance, with development capability, set up to then develop all of those. And they have a collaborative process with the sector within the city to determine which individual cooperatives and co-housing communities are going to take those sites up. Those groups come forward, they work with the developer builds out for them, and they move in. And they've got feminist co-ops, they've got co-housing communities with alternative lifestyle demands, they've got La Borda, a very famous timber frame construction cooperative development. They've got all sorts of interesting projects coming through because all the problems are being solved at an intermediary layer, citywide. They're raising the finance at the city level, they're working with the private sector and the cooperative finance sector in Barcelona and in Catalonia in order to be able to deliver 1,000 homes into community ownership in the space of time in which Bristol has maybe managed 10 or 15. Because it's at the heart of their thinking. Where else might it be at the heart of our thinking? So in Vancouver, there's a community land trust there which brought together the assets of all the existing, or many of the existing cooperatives across British Columbia, which gave it an asset base. It then set itself up as a developer to go and build new developments, and it is building blocks of flats of 200, 300, 400 homes at a time, which it then leases to individual housing cooperatives, with the land remaining in a community land trust. And you look at their website, and by UK standards, you think, God, this is like some G15 housing association. But it is community-led, community-owned, building cooperatives at scale, because they're thinking about things in a different way. They're not saying to people, why don't you, around this table, form a co-op and try and figure out how to build some housing for yourself in Bristol. They're saying, let's all of us in the room set up a developer, build the flats, and then let them manage them. It's just a different mentality. We've some examples in the UK of doing this better. So there are a few larger developments where the result of campaigns or good work, communities have been involved in the process of the development of those sites and are getting homes out the back end of them. So there's a couple in London, which were facilitated by the GLA, St Clement's in Mile End and St Anne's in Haringey, where in one case a community land trust, in the second case hopefully a BME co-op, will be taking homes out of the development, and the community had a significant role in the co-design of the overall scheme. In Cambridgeshire, there's a 500-home garden village being developed by a volume builder, not the greatest choice of, probably they wouldn't have wanted, but the Community Land Trust was a client in the master planning. They sit on the development board overseeing the development. They're going to buy all of the open space and half the affordable homes and all the self-build plots at the end of it. It's a mainstream development that is channeling assets into community ownership rather than into some unaccountable private management structure, and that is meaningfully involving the community in the process of the design. We've also seen a lot of good partnership work, particularly in rural areas. So if you go from here further into the southwest, you can barely walk 10 miles or drive 10 miles without going past a community land trust that has worked with a housing association. A very strong model of partnership between housing associations and communities, where the community takes ownership of the land, it leads on the design process, it works with the tenants moving into the homes, but partners with the housing association's ability to raise the finance and build the homes. Because most of those communities don't want to do that, but they just want to make sure that the right homes are put in the right place and that they can participate in that process and they keep the asset. So when we published our State of the Sector report on the CLT movement back in March, we came across, or kind of in the course of writing it, came up with a statistic that quite surprised me but made a lot of sense and has really shaped my thinking since, which is that 3/4 of community-led homes completed in the UK in recent years have been in partnership with private developers and housing associations. The sector is preoccupied with a model of itself which is entirely grassroots DIY that's totally at odds with the reality of how communities are actually managing to get stuff developed. So what we need to do is think, how do we develop those models and get policy support for them as well? We've got a good deal of the policy support side of things. So Gove came to launch that report. In the summer, he gave a speech with his long-term plan for house building, talking about this philosophy of community-led housing being infused into the industry. If we could infuse that degree of agency and power into the industry would be producing more resilient communities as a result. And we're working on Labour, trying to get them to have the same understanding of the way that this could be part of their agenda of backing the builders. You know, we're all builders in this room. And getting things going with new towns and so on. And again, like new towns, garden cities were basically massive community land trusts. So these aren't new concepts. What we need to do is get it into the mainstream. We need to figure out the pattern book of partnership between community and industry. We need to figure out the services that we're providing to developers, landowners, local authorities to make this simple, to get to the point where we could have a conversation, say, with Bristol City Council and other stakeholders about Temple Meads and say, let's make a third of Temple Meads community-led, which is not that unusual in many other European countries, but currently seems utterly bananas in the UK, and the council more or less told people that. What we need to do is rewire the system for resilience, and the only people who are going to do that are you in this room. Thanks.
So I think we've got, yes, we've got 2 microphones, one on either side of the room, so that's great. Over to the floor for questions.
Just one observation. I love early Marx is great. Pulling the levers of capitalism and Marxism in terms of slightly risky. It is the Radical Housing Conference, but putting power back to people to enable them to imagine that they can become the developer of their own homes is a very powerful and different way of thinking about what we do. Your work in terms of speaking to government within the group, what is your optimism for the rapid change that might need to be done for community-led housing to actually move from stage left into stage centre?
Yeah, I think we've done some of that in the past year with Michael Gove, sadly the dog end of this government. It took us a while to get there. in which the government went from thinking about this as there's a pipeline of 20,000 odd homes to saying, what if this was 5 to 10% of the house building industry? And it forces you to question and rethink what you mean by community-led, what you mean by people building their own homes, and gets people out of that mental mindset of, for example, in self-build, oh, it's all going to be grand designs. You know, I know Richard was speaking yesterday, and you just need people to see how the system works in other countries to think, that's actually not scary, that could be quite normal. And the same with communities having agency in these processes. It's getting politicians and people in industry to have confidence that it's not scary, that there's something in that, there's something of value to them. I think that's the real challenge we have at the moment with Labour is their focus is on large-scale stuff, new towns, strategic sites, is trying to get them to see communities can have agency in that when we, as a country, I think, have a real, like this paternalism, this sense that it's very disabling sense of what we can do ourselves. And sometimes it's just about reminding you, you know, Craig, you live in a community, you're probably involved in all sorts of fantastic things going on in your community. Why do we think that we can't do things? You know, we can. And getting that mental leap from the sort of 20,000 homes to the 5% is critical. And I think we as a sector need to be talking in a way that sounds like it's going to be that and isn't going to be a radical niche. It's a radical normal, you know.
I would say big, bold, and granular. Government can't seem to understand granularity of delivery at all. But anyway, we're not complaining, are we? Who's next?
Oh, it was just a very quick point. I was going to ask, what was the name of the estate in London with 600 homes that you were mentioning? I just didn't get the name.
Yes, it's called Walterton and Elgin Community Homes, or WECH.
Thank you.
Hi, we've got a question from online. It says, great talk. What is the first policy change you think would move this forward?
Only one. Well, we're just working on the final touches of our manifesto at the moment, and also been discussing with the housing minister a new long-term strategy for this. And I suppose the one I would pick is just because it's one that's an immediate opportunity for the government is with the planning system. So the government consulted at the back end of last year on changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, picking up a long-standing ask of ours to ask questions around community-led housing. And we put in a consultation response. We've been discussing that with the minister and with officials. And writing community ownership and community-led development into the planning system would be a significant step forward. And there are two ways in particular we're trying to focus on. One is to say that to reform the policy around large sites, to force the provision of opportunities for this sort of stuff in large sites, where currently it's just vaguely encouraged. And Oliver Letwin showed a number of years ago how that policy isn't really working. So if every single large site became standard, that 5–10% of homes were going to be community-led and self-built, as some local authorities are doing at the local level, if that was a national requirement, that would open up suddenly a big market opportunity for our sector. And then the second one is a community-led exception site. So if communities wish to grow, if there's a democratic community organisation which is bringing forward a proposal for a development, and it's on a site that isn't currently allocated in the local plan, it might be like Melissa's in South Bristol back garden development. It might be like some of the ones in East Cambridgeshire on the edge of a village on a bit of greenfield. If it has community support and it is meeting local need, in principle it should be permitted, subject to meeting other policy requirements. And that policy exists in East Cambridgeshire and has seen a huge uptick in CLT supply in that area, and it would really give communities an advantage when talking to landowners to say, look, you can hold out to get an allocation and you can get market value down the line, or you can work with us today on something that's likely to get a planning consent that this community will support and take a slight hit on the value of that site, but be able to go forward. So we want the planning system to be creating those opportunities systemically across the country for communities to get ownership of land and to be able to be part of development.
Thank you. I was involved in setting up a community land trust back in 2009. I'm still the chair. I keep trying to persuade someone else to do it. And interestingly, I set it up to do with the housing challenge, and that was what I had in mind. Between 2009 and now, it's been much easier to get funding to do other projects, like building a skate park. We're going to have the first community cemetery in the community, in the country. and we managed to establish a community farm. I've only done one housing development because as a volunteer and an amateur, getting funding has been a nightmare. The one I'm trying to do at the moment with support of Agile, you know, I'm getting thrown, I've got to have a registered housing provider. This is an awkward site for 3 homes. What registered housing provider wants to talk to me? So I suppose, you know, you're talking big, and I'm thinking, well, at the scale I'm at, it's much easier to build a skate park and be the first community cemetery than it is to have 3 homes in a site that's going to be given to us for £1. How can it become easier for us to deliver 3 homes than a first community cemetery in the country?
Yeah, so I suppose for a long time we used to think the answer was we need to get you access to grant funding, we need to pull all these different levers so you're able to then do that yourself, and to argue with the government over the requirement for having a registered provider and so on. And that has got us somewhere. You know, it's seen a significant growth in the pipeline of projects, but also might have heard yesterday from Tom Warder about some projects and still the difficulty you have trying to do that kind of stuff in a DIY way. So part of it is about fixing the way that we have government policy around affordable housing finance and so on and so forth to be able to support these kinds of approaches on an equal footing with other solutions in the market. But I think part is also rethinking, why are we asking you to do all the heavy lifting? Right? What you want to do is get those homes produced in your community with presumably, was it 1-bed flats you were talking about earlier, if I recall correctly, and certain characteristics you want about it, but you need other people to be able to come and develop those with you. And what we as a sector need to do is create new entities in the market and partnerships with the likes of Agile and others to be able to come in and work with you and say, right, here's your RP, here's your developer, here's your access to finance. Your role is knowing the community, finding the site, being able to steward and guide that through the process. So I think that's what we're trying to work on more as a sector now, is build that capacity at a bigger level. Just like, like in Barcelona, they weren't asking each individual court to build stuff themselves. It's not easy, We're not there yet, but that's also that granular leap from where we are now to being 5%. It's not going to be by asking everyone to become a property developer.
Jim has a question.
It's kind of similar to the national policy level question, but how can we turn local authorities to understanding better and thinking about these schemes? I did an online talk recently for social care services from the 3 regional authorities from Bristol, South Gloucester and North Somerset, and chatting in the Q&A, people who'd gone along to it thought that was great, but somebody from Bristol Council said, good luck with that, because we know what Bristol Housing team are like.
Yes.
And there was not only no over-the-wall conversations, people who actually thought that there was no hope engaging other parts of the council, and I wonder how we help them to join the dots and help us.
Yeah, I mean, I think my hunch is, and we've done a lot of introspection as a movement in the past couple of years, particularly people who've been working as enablers and trying to get projects happening. And my hunch is a bit like the talk previously from, I forget his name, but the chap from Accessible PRS, is it's not going to be just lots of people having sort of citizen advocacy and trying to bash councils or persuade them of things. It's bringing them a service that solves the problem for them. And it's also not going to be pointing to the sort of often the pioneers who do things in a particular, like a very interesting and purist and complicated way because they were trying to pull something off that no one had done before. But it's seeing in that and being able to sort of extract some DNA and say, here's a more deliverable, replicable product which captures the essence of what was powerful about that example, and here's how we can facilitate it, and here's what you need to do for us to be able to facilitate that. And I think that with a lot of councils, it's just that they're so resource poor, time poor, they don't, they just see this and they immediately think, God, this is going to be a drain on my capacity when I've got enough other things to be doing. We need to turn that around and say we have the capacity. And where parts of our sector have been able to do that, so the reason there are so many rural CLTs southwest of here is because Middlemarch have created that service and demonstrated an ability to deliver projects so that now the local authorities are falling over themselves to back and try and say, how can we put in place supported planning policy? How can we change our housing strategy? Because this is seeing a big uptick in delivery for us. So we need to be, our trouble is that we're too often a problem for councils rather than a solution. It's a bit glib, but I think that's the starting point.
Hello, I'm a local journalist who's done a bit of research into community-led housing, and like the development of eco-homes and things like that in the city. And one thing that me and my colleagues found is that they're often quite exclusive, and the people involved, they benefit the people that can afford to get involved and have the time to inject, their attention into these schemes. I wonder if that's something that you recognise. And you mentioned, about policies and developments in other countries, like leading the way, and it's a lot more simple than it seems. Is there an example there that you could give us where Bristol and the UK more broadly can learn from?
Yeah, so on the inclusivity point, I think there's a big distinction between community land trusts and a lot of other collaborative approaches. So the dominant tenure of community land trust homes is social rent. Community land trusts are set up to meet existing community need, not the needs of the people who are involved in the project. They have to have fair and open allocations processes and so on. I think with other approaches like collective self-build, Ashley Vale and co-housing groups and so on, I think somebody earlier mentioned, as Jim mentioned, it's just a symptom of the fact that the system isn't set up to facilitate this sort of process, and so it's the preserve of those who can bring their own money and social capital to the table to manage to do it. So if you go to Denmark or other places, co-housing isn't necessarily such an exclusive concept if you can facilitate it for a wider range of people. It's just that at the current time, you have to be kind of asset rich, normally in your 50s, able to spend an awful lot of time and find a piece of site in order to do it. So that's how it looks. It's not inherent to the concept. We've also done a lot of work on questions of inclusion in CLTs and thinking about who is involved in that process and how do you make it an empowering one for people, and trying to understand that, so for example, there's a CLT in Tottenham trying to do this around the St Anne's site, and they hired a community organiser to go around and try to get people in more precarious living conditions and greater representation from the black community in Tottenham involved in it. And they were finding people were saying, you want me to get involved in a project where maybe 10 years down the line there might be some housing? Like, why would I do that? Because I'm in housing need now. That's not the right place to involve those people or to expect the involvement of those people in that project. But in the lifetime of a community land trust, there are many ways to be very inclusive and empowering in sharing and building that power base collectively. So that's kind of the concept. In terms of councils, I guess, again, just because it's front and centre of my mind, I mentioned it, Barcelona is a really good example, because that was meeting a real range of needs in that city with some people who are quite excluded and marginalised by the existing housing market. And for sorts of reasons we've been talking about today, it's often to do with health, disability, homelessness, lots of range of things they were able to be part of the process because they weren't being asked to be developers. They weren't being told, here's a bit of land no one else can develop, figure it out. They're like, we're going to build this block of 20 flats, and we're interested in whether, who might this suit and how can we bring you together as a group. That's the sort of thing we've been trying to get the council to think about with, for example, Temple Meads. Huge amounts of money going into that redevelopment. Carve out opportunities for different citizens who are more marginalised in that area to co-produce, particularly the neighbouring communities, to co-produce housing which they take ownership in that process. That could be done. It's been done in other countries.
So they've asked, at present, all funding is for housing, but not for other communal assets, including workplaces and community spaces. How can this change to make these places more sustainable?
Yeah, one of the things that drives me mad is how we silo everything. So community land trusts own housing, workspace, farms, the lot. It's like any asset you can have that you put into the collective ownership of the community to steward. And yet, when they try to do projects, like some of them, for example, they're trying to redevelop things and get some money from the Community Ownership Fund, but there's a flat at the top, and the flat is required as part of the financial model in order to make the whole building work, but housing is ineligible for the Community Ownership Fund, and the Community Housing Fund, which might have financed it, is closed, and it's just maddening that we're constantly tripping people up with trying to do projects with all these different siloed funding pots. And Hastings Commons is another one of our members. They have this spreadsheet of something like 100 different grants they've had over the years just to be able to get 7 dilapidated buildings in the centre of Hastings into community ownership. So the solution, again, part of the manifesto we're putting to government, is to have a sort of root and branch review of these different funding schemes and say, from the point of view of a community organisation, you just need general purpose access to capital and to risk capital in particular, to earlier stages of things. How do we as a sector develop the ability to raise that kind of risk capital and work with our organisations to do development, rather than being constantly dependent on these highly specific different grant pots? And that also goes to many organisations I love and respect that are grant funders or campaigning organisations. It's forever like, oh, we need a high street thing here, we need a housing thing there, we need an energy thing over there. No, because they're all going to be the same thing. You'll have a building on the high street with some housing above it and some solar panels on the roof. You need a single route of finance for that project. I think that's a big mentality shift again that's very hard, because government loves to silo, the third sector loves to silo, it's like maddeningly challenging for community organisations that are trying to pull these different threads together.
But it's going to change.
It's going to change.
It's going to change, because it has to change. So I think I'm not chairing. Over to Chair.
Thanks, Craig. So thank you very much indeed for a brilliant introduction to our session on resilience. Thank you very much, Tom.